This is the Breakfast Leadership Podcast. Boundaries or burnout, you make the choice. Here's your host, Michael Levitt. Welcome to the Breakfast Leadership Podcast. Today, I have a really incredible individual, Maestro Roger Nierenberg. He's the founder of the Music Paradigm. He's a conductor, and he leads his organization to work with incredible organizations that you've heard of and know of. Maestro, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here, Michael.
So, enlighten us on how you made the transformation from being a conductor of orchestras to a leadership consultant transforming organizations all across the globe.
Well, it actually, the starting point was that I was pondering how you can expand the audience for classical music, because I saw that the principal problem that we have in classical music is there's not sufficient audience. There aren't enough people who crave it and who love it and want live music in their lives. So that was what I was searching. And the starting point was, is there a way to take somebody who's an intelligent person, curious and well-educated, but doesn't really feel symphonic music? Is there a way to give that person an experience that makes it come alive for them? That was what I was trying to do. And along the way, I invented this kind of experiential learning that's called the Music Paradigm. And it was a kind of an accident.
Some of the greatest things in the history of the human race were discovered by accident. And this was an amazing discovery. And I don't want to necessarily say it was an accident, but it definitely has transformed organization as well. One of the things that jumped out at me, when reading your book, as well as just researching you and learning more about you, is the concept of listening. And one of the things that I think a lot of leaders today, and probably for a long time, have struggled with was to truly listen. And could you enlighten us a little bit more on your concept of listening and how it makes such a big difference, both from a conductor standpoint and then also in a leadership world?
Well, listening is something which is essential to musicians. Musicians have to train themselves to be able to, while doing many other things, to listen to themselves and to listen to others. And it's not just with curiosity, but it's active. And it involves a lot of mind reading. It involves hearing what the intent is behind the sound, and then predicting based on what you're hearing what the next thing is going to be, and kind of always anticipating and preparing. And musicians tend to listen that way in music, but it has a great deal of power when anybody takes it on. We are trained so much to speak and to write, and we focus on the output. And there's not as much training on how to really take in what's going on, listen to people and to hear them. And what I discovered through my conducting, but then also through the work with the Music Paradigm, is that it's very transformative. When you listen openly and with curiosity, it has a transforming effect. It has a transforming effect on those to whom you're listening. And when you listen well, it inspires other people to listen as well.
That's a great analogy. And one of the things that I noticed because when I first started looking into this, it amazed me the synergies between an orchestra and a team. Because if that orchestra is one note off, unless you are a complete novice and you haven't ever listened to classical music or any type of music in your life, you will notice it. And just like in operations and organizations, if something is off or you have a team or a division that's off, it impacts the entire organization. And I love how you synergize those things. One of the things that jumped out at me too is just, again, watching some of the videos, and I encourage the listeners to do a lot of research, and I'll have it in the show notes as well. But the reaction of the people that you were coaching in these sessions. What are some stories that you can share with the audience today about some of the, I don't know, aha moments or potentially things that really surprised you when you first started working with different teams on the leadership training that you provide?
Well, people are not used to receiving learning through an artistic experience. And what I mean by artistic is that it's kind of a pretend world that you enter into when you sit inside an orchestra, the way I ask the participants in my sessions to do. And at first, you're just kind of idly listening to the sounds. But the deeper I take them in on my kind of tour of the orchestra, the more they begin to understand that the behaviors that are going on in the orchestra are basically the same behaviors that are going on in their organization, meaning that people are interdependent, they collaborate, they work on aligning, they work on adjusting, tuning, all those kinds of things. But you hear it so much clearer in music, especially when you have a demonstration of a sort of dysfunctional behavior, and then you fix it up by correcting what the musicians are doing. And then they hear the difference between what it's like when people are actually really listening well and when they're not, or when they're aligning well as opposed to when they're thinking about themselves primarily. And there's this fascination that people have because they're hearing it as if for the first time. And because it's so spontaneous and so real, people get really fascinated. And what they're not anticipating is that they'll begin to see themselves in this. Because the whole design of the music paradigm is to use the music as a kind of a mirror through which people can see themselves, but they see themselves because it's a metaphor and because it's a sort of a fairy tale, they see themselves much more clearly.
You've worked with a ton of famous corporations and organizations, Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, Kraft, and all of that. But one organization that you recently worked with jumped out at me quite a bit, and it was the Dallas Mavericks of the NBA. You'd listed in your blog that this is something that you've wanted to do ever since you launched your organization, was to work with a professional sports team. Tell us a little bit about that experience, because I'm wondering what the synergies would be in comparing to the corporate world that you've been working with for a long time, what it was like to work with the Mavericks organization.
Well, I begin by saying that people don't understand that the music paradigm, the work that I do, is always customized for every organization. It's not as if I have some kind of routine. And the starting point is when I talk with the people who have engaged me and I ask, what is this meeting about? What are you trying to accomplish? What's your success picture? And then I ask, well, what are the challenges that are standing in the way? What's the mindset and the behavior that you'd like to reinforce? And what is it that you'd like to try to get people to stop doing and become aware of themselves? And then I use the orchestra in order to grow those behaviors spontaneously right in front of them with an orchestra that isn't prepared for this. All they're prepared for is how they're going to play the music, but we do kinds of role plays. So I always customize it for each organization. In the case of the Mavericks, this was an organization that's in the middle of a very important change, because they had a very public kind of embarrassment in some dysfunction of diversity and gender bias in their organization. And it was very public, and a new team was brought in to transform their culture. And so when I worked with them, now, unfortunately, I wasn't working with the players. I was working with the business side, the people who do the marketing and do the community relations and sell the tickets and run the institution in many ways. But it was still fascinating because the commonality of the kinds of issues that they deal with are not so different from other organizations as well.
Yeah, that was very public, some of the challenges that organization faced, and it speaks volumes that they brought you in to help right the ship and correct some behaviors. I anticipate that there would be a lot more organizations, because we've heard about it in the news over the last year and a bit, that that have not been behaving in the best fashion. And I think your training and your leadership really bodes well for organizations to really get in unison about how they're doing, because I find, again, in my experience in working with other organizations, is there's so many silos when it comes to things, and that's not going to bode well for any organization if you're operating in an individual standpoint. Each musician and each note is important for the overall flow of the performance. And in organizations, every time we open up the doors, it is a performance. We're performing for our customers, our clients. If you're in healthcare, your patients, and it makes a lot of sense to have those things in sync, for sure. I guess one of the great things about the show is I always ask people about boundaries and burnout, and I'd love to hear your perspective on how classical music and then the work that you do with the music paradigm can help organizations mitigate and reduce any type of burnout or stress amongst their organizations.
Well, burnout is a common thing in industries that are under stress. In healthcare, for example, which is undergoing so many changes in the way in which money is allocated, and there's so much stress because people are being whipped around each time it changes. By the time the change comes to them, it becomes a major adjustment, and people get discouraged. They get used to one thing, and then they have to redo it, and they begin to feel as though their contribution doesn't matter that much, that they could just be replaced by anybody or be replaced by some kind of robot, and it would be the same. And that's a very demoralizing thing. So all of that really speaks to the problem of how difficult it is for people inside an organization to see the big picture. This is one of the exercises that I always do in each session. I bring a couple of people from their chairs sitting amongst the orchestra. They come and they stand on the podium right next to me. And then they hear what it is that the conductor hears, and they remark about how different it is, how by comparison, what they heard from their chair, while it was compelling, it's not nearly so fascinating and not so engaging as what they hear on the podium. And that's a metaphor for the way it is in organizations, that organizations by their very nature are full of blind spots. And when you sit in an organization for a long time, you get so used to it that you don't realize that you're living in a blind spot. And so what this means is that the leader's job, in large part, is just to shed light on what people can't see, and especially the thing that's so obvious when you're a leader, which is the purpose of your organization and what it does for the people that you serve, and your customers, your clients, your patients, whatever it is, that you have a much clearer idea about how much benefit there is. But for the people who are working, doing the day-to-day work, they can get very abstracted from that. And so burnout is eased when people are connected to how much good they do for other people. And there are all kinds of demonstrations in which I dramatize this in the orchestra. What's it like when people are just task-focused, as opposed to when they're focused on the listener and moving the listener and changing the listener's life. And they hear the orchestra instantly. They hear it energized. They hear it inspired. Everybody can hear that. And what they're thinking is, well, how do we do that? How would we make that so clear to our people? And what would it be like if we acted out of the same kind of energy and inspiration as we heard the orchestra do the second time?
That is leadership gold. And when organizations have a desire to make their organizations sound like a classic orchestra, it is transforming for the leadership, for the employees, the people that work for them, and the clients and customers that they serve, and the impact that they have on society as a whole. It's amazing, well, amazing work.
I couldn't agree with you more. But if I were listening to you saying that, I wouldn't believe it. I would say, well, that's just fairy tale stuff. You know, the fact is that listening to an orchestra is complex. That's part of what makes it so great. And a lot of people, they get lost in the complexity. They can't find their way. But that's exactly what I address in my sessions. I make it so that I enter the inquiry in a way that people have an easy time hearing what's going on and hearing differences. And as they begin to hear, they gain their confidence in being able to observe it. And finally, they do reach a point where they're seeing the commonality between what's happening in the orchestra and their own professional lives. And that's when the light bulb goes off. And that's when you see the expressions that you were talking about earlier on people's faces, this moment of enlightenment. Suddenly they understand what's going on around them with a new kind of clarity. And they also understand their own behavior. And oddly enough, they understand their own power and their ability to affect their own lives. So I think that's why it's such a positive atmosphere in the room. There's so much laughter, there's so much good spirits, and there's such appreciation for beauty as well.
Yeah, and I think we all long for that as people going through life, just to have those connections and enlightenment, to be able to experience something special. And when we have that in our personal lives and our work lives, it makes such a huge difference in how we go about our days, and it makes for, as you said, the reduced burnout, and because we feel like we're making a contribution. We are doing something good for others, and I think when we are operating in that space, it makes a huge difference in everything that we do.
There's another difference between the music paradigm and other kind of more traditional leadership training or leadership learning, or for that matter, teamwork learning and collaborative learning. In most learning, you have somebody up at the front of the room who is wise, who's thought about things a lot, who knows more, and then informs the people in the audience of what that person has learned. That doesn't happen in the music paradigm. In the music paradigm, I never say what it is that we're learning about. I never identify what the wisdom is, but rather I set up the room in such a way that we run a kind of experiment and everybody reaches their own conclusions. Nobody's telling them what it means. And because the learning is discovered by each person individually, that's the kind of learning that they take ownership of, because nobody gave it to them. They found it themselves.
It's amazing, amazing stuff, Maestro. I really appreciate our conversation today, and love the leadership insights and everything that you talked about today. How can our audience find out more about you and the music paradigm?
Well, I think primarily you go to our website, which is musicparadigm.com. And there are videos there. There are blogs that I've taken great pain to try to make clear and understandable and with simple but powerful lessons. And there are photos. There are a number of things, and more and more. I'm always producing videos, and also and a lot of the videos go into blogs, videos and other kinds of devices for people to share the understanding that I've recently come by.
That's great. And the audience, I'll definitely have all of that information in the show notes on the episode. So again, Maestro, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you and all that you're doing for all of us, and making the music that we hear even better in our work lives and our home lives as well. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And until next time, everyone, be well. Hey, it's Michael again. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. If you're like many people, you're dealing with some significant stress and possibly approaching burnout. I know how you feel. In 2009, my burnout led to a year of worst-case scenarios. I do not want that to happen to you. If you go to breakfastleadership.com, you can register for a free webinar on burnout prevention, as well as get a free checklist to have successful mornings. Start off each day the right way. Again, that's at breakfastleadership.com. Also, since you are a loyal podcast listener, I'm asking you to like, rate, and review my podcast on iTunes. I look at all the reviews and appreciate your comments, and it helps other potential listeners discover the content I have on the show. I appreciate you, and thanks again for listening.